Jack Grave. Callahan pushed open the old barn door, the rusted hinges screeching sharply, as if torn from the silence by the snowstorm howling outside in the White Mountains. His flashlight beam swept across the damp, cold wooden floor and stopped on a massive figure huddled in the wet straw. Her broad shoulders filled the narrow space, solid like two wooden beams, but trembling from exhaustion. Her back was marked with overlapping old and new bruises, clear signs of ropes and blows that needed no explanation. When she lifted her head, the light caught her deep black eyes, sharp and wary like those of an Apache woman, accustomed to fighting to survive, making Jack instinctively tighten his grip on the flashlight. She towered over him, nearly touching the barn ceiling, her powerful body still coiled with muscle, even as her breathing came quick from cold and pain. "Stay right there," she said, her voice ragged, hoarse from the blizzard and shallow breaths. Jack didn't back away, but he didn't reach for the gun at his hip either. He saw the ropes she'd torn apart, her wrists bleeding, and the fire burning in her eyes wasn't aggression. It was desperation held together by sheer will. "You're on my land," Jack said slowly, each word falling heavy. "I'm not looking for trouble." No answer, just eyes tracking his every smallest move, like a cornered animal. A while later, Jack returned with a bowl of hot soup, a jug of water, and the thickest blanket he had, stepping slowly so as not to add pressure on the injured woman in the barn. He set the items down on the wooden floor a safe distance from Ayanna, then backed away exactly the same number of steps he'd taken forward, keeping the space between them from shrinking unintentionally. Steam rose from the soup bowl, mixing with the smell of wet snow and cold metal of the night, creating a tension as taut as a wire. Ayanna looked at the things in front of her, then at Jack, her gaze not softening but sharpening, as if measuring a familiar threat. Her voice was hoarse from cold and pain, but the question came out clear, direct, no beating around the bush. "You going to have sex with me?" It wasn't an invitation, nor provocation. It was the question of someone who'd learned that every help came with a price, that her body was often the last currency for one more night of survival. She asked to brace herself, to raise the final barrier before the familiar happened. Jack didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't smirk. He stood still, letting the question settle amid the whistling wind and his own slow heartbeat, then answered in a low, even voice, like stating the obvious: no. No buying people. No trading. No owning. No conditions attached to the soup or the blanket. He said she could eat if she wanted, drink if she needed, sleep if she could manage, and in the morning, if there was a morning, she could go anywhere. Ayanna blinked. A small reflex, but one that revealed confusion. No sneaky glances, no advancing steps, no orders given. Jack turned his face away, not to avoid, but to give her back control of her own space, to show that this safety didn't demand a hidden price. Jack opened the cabin door and stepped aside, not with an inviting gesture but with enough open space for Ayanna to decide whether to step in or not. And when she slowly moved inside, he didn't touch her, didn't urge her, just closed the door to keep the wind from ripping away the warmth just kindled. Inside, the flickering firelight danced on the rough wooden walls, the smell of pine smoke mixing with hot soup to create a fragile but vital sense of shelter. Jack added another log, then retreated to his old chair, sticking to the principle he'd chosen: help without conditions. Ayanna picked the spot closest to the door, back against the wall, where cold drafts still slipped through the board cracks, a position both disadvantageous and safe in the way of someone used to sleeping with an escape route behind her, the small knife still in her hand, its steel blade catching the firelight, not threatening but warning. Jack saw it all and accepted it as natural, like accepting falling snow as snow. No comment, no demand to move, no order to lower the weapon. He placed another blanket on the floor edge, close enough for her to reach if she wanted, far enough not to pressure, then turned back to the stove, pouring hot water into the jug, carefully wiping spilled drops as if this small order could hold back the storm outside. The night dragged on, wind pounding the wooden walls like someone knocking endlessly, and in the rare lulls between gusts, only the crackling logs and Ayanna's heavy breathing remained. Jack changed her bandages when she nodded, movement slow and sure, pausing whenever her shoulders tensed, stepping back a beat to let her breathing steady, then continuing. He didn't ask where it hurt, didn't ask what happened, just did what was needed to stop the bleeding and give the flesh a chance to heal. When the soup cooled, he warmed it again, set it in the same spot, then turned away, letting her eat in her own silence. Occasionally, Ayana's eyes flicked over him, no longer the initial icy sharpness but probing, as if searching for the familiar sign of an unspoken condition, a price to be demanded, when she was weakest. But it didn't come. Jack just sat sharpening his own knife neatly, then putting it away, not to show control but to reduce the presence of metal in the small room. He hung his wet coat near the fireplace, dried his boots, everyday actions of a survivor in the mountains, and that very steadiness gradually changed the breathing rhythm in the cabin. Ayana dozed fitfully, startling once when the wind howled louder, hand tightening on the knife. But Jack didn't approach, just added wood, built up the fire, letting the light spread a bit wider, enough to chase shadows from the corners without invading the space she'd claimed. Dawn came in a heavy gray, snow still falling, and Jack prepared a simple breakfast, hard bread softened in hot water, a bit of salt, setting it down like everything before. No explanation. She ate slowly, eyes occasionally pausing on his hands, the old calluses telling stories of labor and impact more than possession. When she pulled the blanket closer, he opened the damper for smoke to escape, adjusted the fire for even warmth, small but repeated tasks, like a steady heartbeat after panic. The day passed, then night came again, and in that repetition, something unfamiliar happened. Ayana began to trust Jack's predictability, not from any spoken promise, but from what he didn't do, didn't ask, didn't touch, didn't demand. She still kept the knife, still slept near the door, but the blade no longer stood upright like before. Her hand relaxed more, and sometimes very subtly, she pulled the blanket Jack had placed a little closer. Jack noticed the change, and treated it as something fragile to protect with patience, not pressure. He kept his old rhythm, doing small tasks to the point of boredom, making the cabin a predictable place, where kindness came not in bursts, but in steady details, demanding no return. When the wind eased briefly and snow settled, between them was no longer just survival tension, but a thin thread of initial empathy, woven from the calm of a man who refused ownership and the courage of a woman daring to believe there were hands extended without an invoice attached. The following days passed in a slow rhythm that Jack hadn't deliberately set, but that very steadiness gradually revealed the unwritten rules he lived by, not through explanation or slogans, but by placing each thing exactly where it belonged. Oyana observed it from her spot near the door where she still chose to sleep, where cold air still slipped in, and in the way Jack moved, unhurried, unshowy. She recognized an order different from what the world had imposed on her. Jack didn't talk much about bikers or Hell's Angels. He only said enough to answer when she asked, and usually less than necessary, as if principles only held value when kept private in actions. Once, as the fireplace died down and he added wood, Oyana asked why he lived alone in a place where even blizzards came like old enemies. Jack shrugged, said living far from people didn't make him better, but helped him remember his boundaries clearly, and that boundaries between helping and taking, between protecting and owning, were the easiest to lose when people acted in the name of power. He spoke of honor not as a medal on the chest, but as something to do every day, sometimes the hardest thing, not taking what wasn't given, not trading in people, not selling someone else's fear to buy your own peace. Oyana neither nodded in agreement, nor argued. She let the words pass, then watched how he set the bowl in the usual spot, how he turned away when she needed space, how he left the door open long enough for light to spread evenly, but closed it just in time to keep wind from slicing through. Small details, repeated, forming a kind of ethics that needed no witness. Outside, if anyone mentioned Hell's Angels, Oyana knew the image was usually violence, fists, imposed power, but in this cabin, she saw a Hell's Angel carefully folding his coat to avoid dropping snow on the floor, hanging it where wind could dry it, then washing his hands before touching her bandages, as if cleanliness was also a form of respect. When a rabbit got caught in a snare near the cabin, Jack freed it instead of killing it, not from vague compassion, but because he had enough food and didn't need another life to prove survival. Oyana watched, realizing strength here didn't need display. Sometimes in long silences, Jack mentioned roads he'd traveled, faces that came and went, times people confused reputation with character. He said honor wasn't something society gave, but what you kept when no one was watching, and that people could fear him for the cut, for the patch on his back, but that fear didn't give them the right to rewrite what he chose to do. Oyana listened, then watched again, watched how he avoided blocking the exit, how he always asked with his eyes, before touching bandages, how he never asked about her night before, as if another's past was sacred ground. She recognized the bitter contrast between societal stereotypes and personal ethics. Those who claimed legitimacy had used laws to buy and sell her, while the one labeled outlaw was the only one refusing to see her as goods. One evening, when the wind calmed and snow paused briefly, Oyana asked why he wasn't afraid of rumors. Jack smiled faintly, said gossip didn't make him hungry, didn't keep him warm, and didn't decide what he'd do when an injured person showed up at his door. He chose to answer by continuing to do his part right, because that was the only thing he controlled. She saw in that choice a rare steadfastness, not based on group pressure, not on crowd approval, but on an inner boundary drawn long ago. That night, when Ayana set the knife on the floor near her hand instead of gripping it tight, Jack didn't note it as a victory. He just added another log, kept the fire steady, as if every change needed gentle handling to avoid breaking. In the small cabin, amid the white mountains, the unwritten code of a Hell's Angel gradually took shape, not through the noise of violence, but through the quiet of right decisions repeated, and Ayana, by watching how Jack lived more than hearing him explain, began to understand that personal ethics could stand firm even when society chose to judge a person by their most fearsome symbols. One evening, when the storm had eased into long, moaning gusts around the cabin roof, like the tired breathing of an old beast, it was Ayana who broke the prolonged silence between them. Not with tears or trembling, but with a low, dry, steady voice, as if she were reading from a record etched deep into her bones. She said her life had long been accustomed to being hunted, not in the romantic sense of legendary pursuits, but in a much colder, more practical way. The eyes that followed her at roadside gas stations, the seemingly harmless questions that always circled around whether she was traveling alone, where she slept, if anyone was waiting. She said people saw her large build before they saw the person, and in that world, size wasn't protection, but an invitation to those who believed everything could be subdued if the price was cheap enough or the violence great enough. Ayana spoke of being trailed for dozens of miles on endless highways, where the line between a normal trip and a hunt was as thin as early season ice, of the time she was ambushed when leaving her community to bring medicine to a relative, when darkness and familiarity were exploited to make her a target. She didn't describe in detail what happened next. She didn't need to, because the scars on her back and wrists told enough of the story about ropes, about blows not meant to kill but to break the will, about being sold from one hand to another like difficult cargo but valuable. What made her voice drop wasn't the physical pain, but the memory of how people talked about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Numbers, appraisals, crude jokes turning a person into property. Ayana said that in those makeshift rooms, help was never free. A bowl of food, a blanket, a door closed against the wind all came with an implied price, and that price almost always was her body. She learned to recognize the moment before it happened, learned to ask the question before others asked it for her, because asking early gave her an illusion of control, a second to brace herself before the boundary was torn away. I asked not because I wanted to, she said, eyes fixed on the flames licking the log. I asked because if I didn't, they would decide for themselves, and when they decided, I was no longer a person. Jack sat across from her, not interrupting, not showing shock as if this were an alien story. He just listened, occasionally adjusting the fire so the light didn't flicker, keeping the room stable enough that her words weren't carried away by the wind. Ayana said there was a time she fought back hard enough that one man never got up again, and that death clung to her like a mark, both proof she could survive and an excuse for others to label her dangerous, frightening, thereby justifying treating her as something to be controlled. She didn't ask for forgiveness for it, nor try to justify. She just said that from that moment she understood more clearly than ever a brutal truth in this world. Women like her always paid a price, whether with silence or with blood. She turned to Jack, not seeking comfort, but to confirm he was still there, that her words weren't falling into emptiness, and to explain why the question in the storm night came out so fast. Because every survival experience she had told her that help was rarely unconditional. That men who helped often thought they'd bought some right, and that the only way not to be caught off guard was to lay out the harsh question from the start. At least when I ask, she said, I'm still the one setting the terms, no matter how bad those terms are. Jack didn't argue, didn't try to fix the past with promises. He just said slow and sure that she didn't owe anyone that question, that surviving didn't force her to keep paying the same kind of price forever. He didn't say the world would be different, Didn't say those things wouldn't happen again. He just spoke for himself that anything he did in this cabin came without a hidden invoice. Ayanna listened, then looked back at the recent days like a chain of evidence. The soup bowl always placed in the same spot, the distance always maintained, the bandage changes always pausing when she tensed, the eyes always asking before hands reached. She realized that the question, once her survival armor, no longer needed raising every night, not because danger vanished, but because here in this small space there was a man refusing to exploit even when no one forced him to be decent. Ayanna didn't cry. Tears didn't make her stronger, and she'd never survived by appearing weak. Instead, she took a long breath, straightened her back more, as if reclaiming part of the weight stolen by others' unspoken deals. The knife stayed near her hand, but no longer gripped until her knuckles went white, and in that subtle shift, Jack didn't see it as victory or reward. He saw it as a fragile signal to protect with steadiness, not demands. After Ayanna spoke things not meant to be told, the cabin seemed a little wider, not because the wooden walls moved, but because the air between them was no longer taut. Jack continued living in his familiar rhythm, and that very rhythm, predictable to the point of certainty, gradually revealed fragments of his past. He didn't intend to display but didn't hide either. He didn't tell stories in order, didn't pick dramatic moments. Sometimes just a sentence dropped while fixing the door hinge, or sharpening the knife, then putting it away, as if violence for him was something laid down long ago. Jack said he'd been in places where noise was the law, where people lived by reflexes faster than thought, where reputation was built on fists and fear. He'd once believed strength was the only way to keep himself and those riding with him safe. Then there were losses, no need to name them, big enough to break that belief, quiet enough to make him realize power couldn't control death, and that the more you demanded ownership, the easier you lost. He chose to leave the main roads not to evade responsibility, but to put himself in a space where every choice was clear, where doing right got no crowd applause, and doing wrong left no one to blame. Ayanna heard those fragments fall like pebbles into water, not making big waves but spreading into long circles. She realized Jack didn't probe deeply, not from indifference, but because he understood asking could be a form of taking, a way to enter uninvited land. He said some questions, even under the name of concern, still demanded access, and that respect sometimes meant stopping at the threshold. In the following days, Ayanna started noticing small choices reflecting that philosophy. Jack didn't enter the room when she changed bandages unless she signaled. He tapped lightly on the doorframe before opening, even knowing she was there. He didn't touch the items she placed beside her, as if they marked territory to acknowledge. She saw him control his strength by not using it, saw a man who'd passed through violence choosing restraint as discipline, not weakness. When Ayanna asked why he wasn't afraid of being taken advantage of, Jack said that fear had once led him to bad decisions, that he'd learned to set boundaries instead of building walls, and that boundaries only meant something when they protected both sides. Gradually, Ayanna's view of men and power began to shift, not with a sudden flip, but with small adjustments. Power no longer the ability to take, but the ability not to. Strength no longer imposition, but keeping yourself from becoming what you hate. She recognized in Jack a rare balance between hardness and stepping back, between readiness to protect and readiness to move aside, and that very balance made her feel not pushed into responding or proving. In the nights after, when wind rose again, Ayanna slept deeper, not because danger vanished, but because she trusted the consistency of a man who'd set his own laws. The knife stayed near, but her hand no longer reached for it as first reflex. Jack didn't see the change as achievement. He kept the distance, kept not asking, kept doing what needed doing so tomorrow could unfold as expected. And in that quiet, two people forged by different kinds of violence found a new equilibrium. No one owned the other, no one needed to prove stronger, just two rhythms, gradually adjusting to exist side by side, without invasion, letting the past rest in its place, and letting power, for the first time, no longer be something to seize. That night the storm grew fiercer, heavier, as if the White Mountains decided to test everything still standing to the limit. Wind slammed the cabin with brutal blows, making the wooden walls groan. Snow poured through window cracks like white smoke, and then a sharp crack. The power went out completely. The electric heater died, leaving the room plunged into darkness, and a cold that rose so fast it could almost be heard. Jack reacted from the habit of someone who'd lived through many harsh winters. He gathered wood, started a fire in the backup wood stove, adjusted the chimney so wind wouldn't blow back, but the storm was so strong the flames only held modest warmth. not enough to drive out the cold sinking into floor and walls. Asaina felt it in her body first. Old wounds began to ache, breathing shortened and survival instinct pulled her tighter against the wall, where cold drafts slipped through but also where she could control the exit. Jack saw the change and knew exactly what would happen if the temperature kept dropping. He didn't say much, just pulled extra blankets, spread them closer to her than before, still keeping distance, then sat opposite to block some wind. Time passed slowly, cold advancing layer by layer, and in that thick silence, Jack stated the obvious like a survival calculation. If they didn't share body heat, this night would be very long. Asaina looked at him, eyes not panicked but coldly alert, because she'd known that rule long ago, and at the same time another part of her began preparing for the familiar, the unspoken trade, the price to pay, because that's how the world had worked whenever life was on the scale. Jack didn't move closer right away. He waited, letting the decision be hers, so no step could be seen as imposition. When she nodded very slightly, he shifted, sat closer, back against the wall, the two keeping enough space for warmth to spread but not touching the zone that would make her tense. Blankets were pulled over both, thick and rough, smelling of wood smoke in the fabric. Wind howled outside, but inside the cabin breathing gradually synced, slowed. Ayana waited, not with hope, but with honed wariness, waiting for a gesture crossing the line, a searching hand, a demand spoken or unspoken. She waited, ready to draw the knife, ready to endure, ready to pay the familiar price. But it didn't happen. Jack kept his hands on his knees, open, not clenched. He leaned only enough to block wind, not enough to press. When she shivered slightly, he pulled the blanket higher without touching skin, then held still again. Time passed in heavy minutes, and that very non-happening began to change the night's weight. Ayana realized warmth coming from his steady breathing, from the blanket's heat retention, from wind being blocked, sources of heat demanding nothing in return. She relaxed gradually, bit by bit, like removing invisible armor layers. The knife stayed near, but no longer the center of focus, her hand sliding off the handle to the blanket edge for warmth. Jack didn't take it as a signal to advance. He held his discipline because he knew trust came not from reassuring words, but from boundaries held firm in the harshest circumstances. Outside, the storm roared, snow hammered windows like hail, and at one point the cabin roof shook hard enough that both tensed. Jack shifted a bit more to block wind, then stopped again, leaving space for Ayana to adjust herself. She listened to his heartbeat, slow, even not the rhythm of desire, but of someone guarding life through the night, and in that forced closeness, she recognized something unfamiliar. Safety could exist without trade. The night dragged on, fire in the wood stove fading. Jack got up to add wood twice, each time gently so as not to wake her. When he sat back, the blanket was adjusted practically. No extra gestures. Ayana dozed fitfully, then slept deeper, for the first time in many nights, not startled by an unexpected touch. And when she woke in a midnight moment, seeing everything still the same, his hands still in place, distance still kept, a part of her let go quietly, without announcement, just a longer breath. Jack was awake too, listening to the storm, tending fire, tending wind, tending so boundaries weren't shifted by the cold. He knew every minute passing, without the familiar happening, was a minute of trust built by action. As dawn neared, the storm eased, cold receded slowly like tide, and in the dim gray of morning, Ayana realized she'd lived through the night, not by preparing for harm, but by sharing warmth without conditions. She didn't say thank you. Those words were too small for what had happened. Jack said nothing either. He just cleared the stove ashes, cracked the door for smoke to escape, adjusted the blanket so she wouldn't get colder. In that silence, trust was strengthened not by promises or explanations, but by a simple enduring truth. There are nights, even when the storm is heaviest and cold forces people close, when warmth can still exist without trade, and the very fact that the familiar didn't happen became the clearest proof that boundaries were respected, that safety could be maintained by discipline, and that sometimes the strongest way to protect someone is to take nothing from them, even when circumstances allow. As the storm withdrew, revealing a dull gray morning heavy with silence, the white mountains looked as if clawed by an invisible hand. Snow crusted into hard streaks along the trail down to the valley, and on those streaks signs of the old world began to return. Jack noticed before Ayana, not with his eyes but from the habit of someone who'd lived long enough to read small changes, tire tracks cutting across the fresh snow. Not deep but decisive, the smell of gasoline mixing into the cold air, the sound of an engine throttled down at just the right distance, not to echo too far. He didn't say anything right away, just put on his coat, checked the door latch, placed more wood near the stove as if doing a routine task, then glanced at Ayana, a look asking before acting. She understood immediately, stood up, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the knife returning to its familiar spot, but her eyes held no panic like before. They were focused, as if part of the past had just surfaced from under the ice. The vehicle stopped at the forest edge, then a dry, harsh laugh rang out, familiar enough to knot Ayana's stomach. Those men needed no introduction, because the way they walked said it all. The confidence of those who believed they had the right, that this world always allowed them to put a price on anything that could move. Two men approached the cabin, thick coats, hats pulled low, eyes scanning the area like inventorying stock. One whistled when he saw the large footprints leading inside, his voice dragging out. Filthy, big cargo like that got pretty far. Ayana felt the word cargo like a blow to the chest, the old language slamming straight into the present, dragging along the smell of ropes and unspoken deals. Jack stepped onto the porch, not shielding Ayana with his body in a showy way, nor retreating. He stood exactly where he could keep the door in reach, voice calm like discussing the weather. They laughed, a familiar laugh of those who'd won by making others afraid, and said they'd followed the tracks, that the big Apache girl belonged to them, that there was a contract, money, people who'd ask if the goods weren't delivered. Jack didn't ask what the contract was. He didn't acknowledge language turning people into property. He just said this was his land, that there were no goods here, that if they wanted to talk they should change their tone. One stepped forward half a pace, eyes sliding past Jack to find Ayana, as if he were just a temporary obstacle. He talked about shipping costs, damages, debts, and in every word, Ayana heard the old lesson again. When people are entered into ledgers, ethics become an optional fee that can be cut. She gripped the knife, waiting for the familiar moment, when violence erupted, when the man in front would demand back the price he'd invested. But Jack didn't let the moment happen the way they expected. He didn't raise a gun, didn't growl, didn't threaten with his past. He said, clearly, loud enough for the whole forest to hear, that she belonged to no one, that no transaction was recognized here, that if they wanted to keep treating people as commodities, they should turn the vehicle around and leave while they still could. That calm made them pause a beat, because they were used to either cowering or overreacting. Restraint wasn't in their script. One spat into the snow, smirked, said the law here didn't protect those playing morality games, that they'd be back with more people, more papers, more guns. Ayana watched Jack, waiting to see if the boundary would retreat under that threat, waiting to see if moral choice held firm. When real risk stood on the porch, Jack didn't respond with escalation. He responded by holding his position, not advancing, not backing down, and with one short sentence: if they came back, they'd face the consequences of crossing this line. Not a heroic vow, not bragging, just a statement of responsibility. Wind whipped through, carrying smoke and pine sap, and in that moment the old world where power was measured by the ability to seize faced off directly against Jack's choice, where strength was measured by the ability not to seize. They backed off, not convinced, but recognizing no bargaining here. The eyes of the one who'd laughed earlier darkened like a promise to return differently. When the engine faded, Ayana realized her hands were shaking not from fear, but because an old door had just closed, the door of unspoken deals she'd been forced to live with. Jack closed the door, slid the bolt, then returned to his unfinished tasks, as if the confrontation was part of a normal day. He added wood, checked the windows, set the water jug on the stove. Ayana stood there, feeling the threat still hanging outside like an unresolved cloud, but also feeling something else, heavier and truer. A moral choice just defended not with fancy words, but with willingness to bear the risk. The old world had come calling and been refused at the threshold, and in that refusal, Ayana understood this confrontation wasn't just about safety for one night, but about affirming a principle in a world accustomed to treating people as commodities, a principle Jack had chosen and was paying for by not allowing himself to slide to the easier path. After the vehicle's sound vanished into the forest, the threat didn't disappear, but thickened, like cold mist settling on skin, and Jack knew they'd return the way they knew best. More people, more confidence, believing this time fear would finish the unfinished work. He didn't tell Ayana it was coming. He didn't need to, because the way he prepared was the answer. He rechecked the door latch, cleared space, placed essentials within easy reach, not to show strength but to minimize unnecessary movement when the moment arrived. Ayanna watched, without asking, because she'd learned to read silent choices, and in her eyes was no longer the familiar weight of someone about to be bargained over, but the presence of someone standing firm in her own decision. The afternoon passed heavily, light fading, and as darkness covered the trail, the engine returned, this time without hiding. Two vehicles stopped right in front of the cabin. Doors slammed open, footsteps crunching snow like declaring power. They were more, voices louder, and immediately, their language reverted to the old mold, talking about papers, ownership, damages, as if just naming it was enough to turn a person into a ledger entry. Jack stepped onto the porch, standing at the boundary he'd chosen from the start, neither crossing nor retreating. He didn't raise a weapon, but didn't hide that he was ready to own every word he said. One advanced, smirked, asked the price, the terms, asked how much to avoid trouble, and in that question, Ayanna heard the entire old world compressed into a simple equation. Everything could be bought, if enough money, or enough threat. Jack shook his head, very slightly, then said, slow and clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding, she belongs to no one. No negotiation, no number on the table, no other way to call that truth. They laughed, said everyone talks like that until night falls, and cold wakes people up, that morality doesn't warm you, that boundaries are just chalk lines on dirt. Jack didn't reply with philosophy. He replied by holding position, by not stepping back though, wind whipped harder, and with a second sentence, shorter, heavier, people are not commodities. This time silence stretched longer because that statement wasn't a moral proclamation for debate, but a conscience's legal boundary. Crossing it meant facing consequences. One shifted tone, cold and sharp, mentioning what they could do, mentioning others, other places, as if the future could be held hostage. Ayanna felt her hand tighten, but before the old reflex rose, she saw Jack shift slightly to stand between her and them, not shielding possessively with his body, but placing himself accountable for his words. He said that if they crossed this threshold, they'd bear the consequences of that choice, not an empty threat, but the commitment of someone who'd waited and accepted the risk. They eyed each other, measuring not Jack, but what couldn't be bought here, steadfastness. Finally, one spat into the snow, cursed, signaled retreat, leaving a promise to return like a thin cut in the air. When the vehicles turned away, Jack didn't pursue, didn't fire, didn't gloat. He stood until the sound faded completely, then closed the door, bolted it, and returned to the cabin like returning to the rhythm that needed preserving. Ayanna breathed out, slow, deep, feeling a fundamental shift for the first time. The question that had defined her survival was answered not with promises or deals, but with someone willing to stand firm under pressure without demanding she pay a price. She didn't say thank you because the word was too small. Instead, she looked at Jack with new recognition. Not a man strong because he could seize, but strong because he refused to seize even when pushed. After the door closed and the bolt slid into its familiar spot, the cabin returned to its slow breathing, as if it had just weathered a strong gust and self-adjusted to stay upright. Jack didn't turn to Ayanna right away. He let the quiet have time to settle, so as not to turn the recent moment into an invisible lever. He did the small habitual tasks, clearing the stove, brushing ashes, setting the kettle on the fire, tasks carrying no message beyond the day continuing as it should. Only when everything stabilized did he speak, voice low and even, like placing a stone on the ground for all to see clearly. She owed him nothing, not for the storm, not for the soup bowls, not for him standing on the porch. No invoice, no unspoken agreement, no promise to repay later. He said that if she wanted to leave when it got light, he'd point the way, prepare supplies, and step aside for her to go. If she wanted to stay another night or longer, that was her choice too, and that choice wouldn't change how he treated her. Ayanna listened, and this time she didn't search for the trap behind the words, because the words carried no demands. She watched how he spoke, not staring to pressure, not turning away to avoid, a posture acknowledging the other person's right to decide. Inside her, old reflexes stirred, then slowed. For years, staying had rarely been a choice. It was usually the result of no path left, of inflated debts, of bought fear. She stood, took a few steps in the cabin, feeling the wooden floor creak lightly underfoot, firelight reflecting on walls. She looked out the door, where snow still covered everything white, where the old road had just been refused, but hadn't vanished. When she turned back, the decision wasn't declared like a victory or surrender. It was said simply, surely she would stay, at least for now, because that was what she chose, not because she owed. Jack nodded, very slightly, like noting a fact placed correctly. He didn't advance, didn't touch, didn't alter the distance held from the start, because respecting choice also meant respecting the space of that choice. The evening passed in a new order, no more dramatic, but lighter. Jack prepared food, set it down as usual. Ayanna ate, not hurried, not probing. The small gestures still repeated, and that very repetition reinforced what had just been said. When bedtime came, Ayanna paused at her habitual spot near the door, then slowly changed her mind. She pulled the blanket toward the small bed by the stove, not to be closer to Jack but closer to warmth, and in that decision there was no concession to fear. The knife stayed near, but she set it on the low table, within reach but not in hand, like a subtle adjustment of control. Jack saw and didn't comment. He added wood, adjusted the fire, then sat in his chair, keeping the agreed distance. Night came calmer than forecast, wind outside murmuring like an overtold story. Ayanna lay down, body tensing habitually, then gradually relaxing, muscle groups releasing as no danger signal forced her to stay rigid. She waited, still waiting, but this time waiting to see if her choice would be retracted by an unexpected condition. Nothing happened. Jack remained there, tending the fire, tending boundaries, tending words already spoken with unchanging action. Time passed, and for the first time in a very long while, Ayanna realized she'd slept without raising the familiar layers of defense in order. Sleep came not like a fall but like a slow, controlled step down. She woke once in the night, from a strong gust, and saw everything still as when she closed her eyes. Distance, firelight, quiet, and in that moment a clear thought emerged. Staying could be a safe choice when it didn't require payment. Morning arrived and soft gray snow settled more, and Ayanna woke not reaching for the knife, but with a longer breath. Jack had prepared hot water, set bread on the table. No reminder, no probing look. She ate, stood, walked a few steps in the cabin like checking reclaimed territory, and felt a new balance. Power no longer in the ability to take away, but in the ability to let choice exist. Jack said the day would be cold, but they could step outside a bit if she wanted. She nodded, not to leave, but to go onto the porch, look at the snow, the forest, the road that had brought the old world here and been refused. When she came back in, the decision to stay needed no repeating. It was present in how she hung her coat by the door, in how she set the knife on the shelf, in how she sat near the stove and leaned back against the wall without tensing. Jack continued his rhythm, not changing to deserve, not demanding to reciprocate, and that very lack of demand kept Ayanna's choice intact. By night, when she lay down and sleep came faster than before, no defense ritual activated, not because danger vanished, but because the right to choose had been affirmed by consistency. In the cabin, amid the white mountains, staying was no longer the result of storm or fear, but an active decision, respected and upheld. And in that decision, Ayanna found a new kind of safety, not safety granted by someone else, but safety born from being allowed to choose without having to pay a price. The morning after, when thin sunlight slipped through the snow-laden pine branches and fell on the dirt road leading to the cabin, Ayanna sensed a very subtle shift in the air, not the smell of gasoline or the familiar engine sound of hunters, but a different presence, more orderly, calmer, like a formation that knew where to stand without blocking the light. Jack stepped onto the porch, looked down the road, then turned back. No alarm in his voice, just saying a few people would stop by. The way he said it carried no request for permission, no command, but like announcing the weather. The vehicles that appeared later didn't rush in, didn't show off, parking far enough away that the cabin wasn't surrounded. The men who got out wore thick coats, worn gloves, walking with the steady gait of those used to long roads and headwinds. They looked at Jack first, nodding very slightly. A ritual without words. Then their eyes met Ayanna's, and what caught her attention wasn't curiosity or challenge, but acknowledgement. They looked to know she was there, then shifted their gaze elsewhere, keeping her space uninvaded. No one whistled, no one joked, no one sized her up. Those eyes didn't try to take, just confirmed the boundary already set. Jack introduced briefly, names enough to know who was who, no pasts, no legends. He said there was a threat, that the cabin needed peace, and that was enough. The others nodded, no details asked, no proof demanded. They spread out from the instinct of those who know how to hold a safe perimeter, one checking the trail, one standing at the forest edge, one fixing a board bent by wind. Small tasks, but in the right places. Ayanna watched it all from the doorway, feeling the clear difference between flashy power and quiet protection. No one stood in front of her like shielding property. No one stood behind like guarding an item. They stood beside her space, letting that space be. When one needed water, he asked Jack, not looking at Ayanna as if she had to ask for him. When passing through, they signaled with a nod, a short word like rules long in place beyond any oath. In how they behaved, Ayanna saw a different discipline from those she'd known, the discipline of not crossing boundaries uninvited. At one point, one laughed about the cold, a harmless joke, then went quiet upon realizing Ayanna was listening, not from fear but respect. Jack wasn't the center of attention, he was the anchor where decisions aligned, but no one tried to prove closeness or strength. They worked like meshing gears, quiet, unshowy, and when talking was needed, they stepped away from the cabin, keeping private space free from voices. Ayanna felt something rare, safety not from one person straining, but from a community that kept its word through actions. She stepped onto the porch to breathe, and the men automatically shifted aside, clearing the way. Without Jack prompting, their eyes glanced, then moved on, as if her presence was a fact to respect, not something to comment on. In that moment, Ayanna understood that what Jack had chosen wasn't a lone exception, but part of an unspoken culture, not perfect, not saintly, but one that held boundaries when needed. One brought a water barrel, set it near the stove, not saying for her, just leaving it here, like placing a tool in its spot. Another fixed the door latch, checked the hinge, then stepped back, so no one could say protection meant possession. As the sun rose higher, they ate quickly, standing, not taking the table, not taking space. Trash gathered, no extra traces left. Ayanna saw in those details a consistency. Kindness needed no explanation, just no violation. At one point, one in the group asked Jack quietly about the valley road, and Jack answered by pointing. No storytelling. No one asked about Ayanna. No one asked who is she in a possessive sense. Just a simple confirmation among them that everything's good, and that covered the whole space. By afternoon, when the work was done, and the threat pushed back from near the cabin, the others began leaving in the order they'd arrived. No ceremony, no grand promises. Before getting in the vehicle, one turned back, looked at Jack, then at Ayanna, nodded once, a short gesture, but enough to say the boundary had been seen, and would be respected. Ayanna recognized in that nod no condescension, just acknowledgement of her right to exist without conditions. When the engine faded, the cabin returned to quiet rhythm, but not fragile quiet. It had the weight of choices just communalized. Jack closed the door, bolted it, returned to the stove as usual, not saying it's okay because okay wasn't permanent, but a chain of actions to maintain. Aluchard sewed by the fireplace, feeling a deeper shift in how she saw the world. Not all groups of men operated by seizure, not all strength demanded rights. There were communities that existed by holding boundaries for each other, by protecting without invading. She said it very softly, not as a conclusion, but as an observation just proven. Jack nodded. No rebuttal, because he knew the message needed no verbal reinforcement. Evening came. The wood stove burned steady, and Aluchard prepared her sleeping spot, unhurried, untensed. The knife set on the shelf like last night, not from forgetting, but from choosing. In the firelight, the morning figures were gone, but their trace remained not on snow but in the sense of safety without trade. After the vehicles left and the cabin regained its steady breathing, another quiet emerged, not the quiet of vigilance, but one allowing small things to be noticed, and in that quiet affection began to grow in the slowest way possible, without declaration, without naming. Jack continued living as he always had, adding no gestures to prove anything, subtracting no discipline held. That very unchangedness reassured Aluchard more than any soothing words. They shared cold mornings, where hot water was set on the stove before someone needed it, afternoons fixing fences tilted by wind, evenings with steady fire and silence that could stretch without weighing heavy. Aluchard realized she was noticing details unrelated to survival, how Jack folded his coat so snow didn't fall on the floor, how he paused a beat before handing bandages, how he asked with his eyes before opening the window. Those details carried no tint of desire, but of respect, and because of that they became intimate. Jack noticed subtle changes in Aluchard too, but didn't name them. She set the knife a bit farther each night, not to prove trust, but because it no longer needed centering. She stood by the stove longer, shoulders relaxed. She stepped onto the porch mornings, breathing deep like someone with time. They talked more, but not about big things, about how weather would shift, which road had less wind, whether remaining coffee beans would last the week. Conversations of shared living, not negotiation. When touch happened, it was task touch, passing a log, holding a ladder, pulling a door, and in those moments both recognized bodies could be close without being pulled into another story. One evening, when wind was rare calm, Apache sat on the porch step watching darkening sky, and Jack sat a proper distance away, same direction. They didn't talk about the storm night, didn't mention those who'd come, just let silence do its part. In that silence, Apache suddenly realized a simple, profound thing. She no longer prepared the question in her head. The question that once snapped out as survival reflex, the title question, hadn't appeared in many days, not from prohibition or avoidance, but because it was no longer needed to protect her. She didn't need to ask first to raise a fence. The fence was there, held by steady actions. Jack didn't recognize its absence as victory. He just kept setting the bowl in the usual spot, kept necessary distance, kept not promising what he couldn't control, precisely not making big promises. No always, no forever gave these days real weight. Everything measured by whether tomorrow unfolded like today. Apache began sharing fragments without wounds, a memory of rain smell on red earth, an old community song, how wind shifts signaled season. Jack listened, not collecting, not turning them into keys for other doors. When he shared also small fragments, a road he'd taken in fall, a friend who fixed engines by ear, a time he learned timely silence could save an argument, affection formed in knowing when to stop, and letting untold stories stay put. Some evenings, Ayanna sat a bit closer, not from cold, but to hear logs crackle. Jack noticed and adjusted the blanket for both to warm, no touch, no pull. Desire, if present, wasn't named, wasn't denied, just set below trust, like an underground stream needing no surface to prove existence. Ayanna realized what she was experiencing wasn't external protection, but safety allowing feelings to emerge without demand. She could chuckle softly at a casual remark, stay silent when not wanting to answer, choose closeness without misunderstanding. Jack, by holding boundaries, created space for bonding to happen at its pace, not pushed by circumstance or past. One morning, when snow melted into thin water streaks, Ayanna stood looking at the forest, and Jack handed her dry gloves without words. She took them, not needing but understanding that was his way of caring, unshowy, no return demanded. In that moment, bonding took shape not with vows, but with a chain of consistent small choices. By night, when Ayanna lay down and sleep came lighter than ever, she realized she no longer scanned the room habitually. The title question didn't appear, not suppressed but replaced by a new feeling, trust arriving before desire, and thus desire needing no role as protector or bargain. Jack stayed in his chair, tending fire, tending rhythm, and in the cabin amid the white mountains, the shift was complete from protection to emotional bonding, not in an explosive moment, but by allowing each day to pass without harming the previous day's boundaries. Spring came to the White Mountains quietly, by small signs only those staying long enough noticed, thin ice on the porch melting by noon, damp earth smell rising under retreating snow, faint water flow in the back gully like a heartbeat waking. Jack repaired the porch roof, replaced boards warped by winter wind, while Ayanna cleared the outdoor cooking area, tasks needing little discussion because shared rhythm had arranged them. They didn't call it building, but every nail driven, every log stacked neatly was a decision to stay another day. The change in Ayanna's body came as quietly as the season, without warning, just a morning feeling more tired than usual, an afternoon when stove smoke turned her stomach, and then one night when spring wind blew gently through the window. She placed a hand on her belly and understood. She didn't panic, didn't rush to say. Experience taught her big things didn't need announcement to exist. But when Jack noticed the difference, how she paused longer before lifting the water barrel, how she rested sooner by the stove, he asked not to intrude, but to confirm if she needed anything. Ayanna looked at him, long, and this time no habitual question snapped out. The question once survival armor had no place in this moment. She just said a life was forming, voice calm like talking about tomorrow's weather, and placed his hand on her belly so he could feel the truth himself. Jack stood still, not from overwhelm but understanding the weight of what was entrusted, not ownership but absolute trust. He made no grand promises, no fragile words. He said they'd need more water, more food, a warmer spot when winter returned. Practical sentences holding commitment in present tense. They didn't discuss marriage, set schedules, name the future with formal titles. Their shared life continued built by keepable small decisions, expanding storage, planting rows where sun hit more, reinforcing windows against spring rain gusts. Ayanna moved slower, listening to her body, and Jack adjusted work rhythm accordingly without turning it into noted sacrifice. He carried heavy things but didn't strip her right to work. He asked before helping, not social politeness, but knowing respecting choice was the most enduring care. Longer evenings with more light, they sat on the porch watching the valley change color, talking simple things, wind names, rain directions, returning bird sounds. Ayana told of spring back home, Jack of a green road years ago. No vows on the table, but a growing certainty like a seedling tomorrow would be prepared, and if trouble came, handled without invading each other's boundaries. Ayana realized pregnancy didn't trigger demands. No one used it to bind, no one to trade. Care came from repeatable things, a cup of water in the right spot, a chair pulled out before needed, an afternoon Jack stayed home during long rain. And in all that, the haunting question didn't return, not forbidden, not avoided, simply unneeded, because the foundation had shifted. Jack changed unshowily too. He adjusted the bedroom for softer morning light, set a low chair by the window, prepared for coming months like preparing for winter, by foresight not promises. When Ayana was tired, he stayed near without rushing touch. When she wanted alone, he stepped back without questions. Their bonding had no recognition ritual, but the durability of things done right over time. Spring deepened, snow retreated from trails, valley opened like new space where past no longer dragged each step. Ayana walked more, stopped when needed, chuckled softly at small things, and in that chuckle no guard. Jack saw and didn't try to hold the moment. He let it pass like wind, trusting what was built on solid boundaries needed no clutching. One afternoon, light spring rain falling, Ayana stood under the porch roof, hand on belly, saying she'd never thought she'd stay anywhere long enough to see seasons change color. Jack replied staying put wasn't standing still, but choosing a direction and stepping together. They didn't call it family, no need to define. They called it today made full. By night, stove fire steady and rain stopped. Ayana lay down and slept deep. No room scan, no question prepared for morning. Sleep came as permission, and in that permission, old fears lost power. Spring continued, and with it, a simple truth affirmed by time. When the question is no longer needed, not because denied, but because the world around it changed enough for people to stay without paying a price. When summer touched its first edge and morning light lingered longer on the slopes, the family formed not by announced ritual, but by each day lived fully and chosen again like the first. Jack and Ayana hung no sign, changed no names, signed no papers to label what they had with an easy term. But the cabin amid the white mountains had changed tone. It carried the steady breath of two waking together, preparing together, fixing what needed fixing, and leaving alone what should be left alone. Ayana moved slow and sure, her body self-adjusting to the life growing inside, and Jack learned to read those signals like reading wind shifts. He didn't stand ahead to decide for her, didn't stand behind to push, just beside close enough to support when invited. Days passed with small work, adding shelter roof, restocking pantry, planting more rows, checking trails, tasks without power's glamour, but creating peace through consistency. When visitors came, glances stayed proper. When questions arose, answered with clear boundaries. When silence not hastily filled. Ayana realized the deepest change wasn't landscape or rhythm, but the position of the once haunting question. It no longer stood guard in her mind whenever someone entered her space, not forgotten, but answered by time. That answer didn't come as bold declaration, but as a chain of small connected choices, choosing no trade when advantageous, no seizure when opportunity, standing firm when the old world knocked with easy promises. Jack claimed no credit. He knew peace wasn't reward for the strong, but result of discipline holding boundaries even unseen. Ayana found herself no longer measuring the room before sleep, no longer preparing defense scripts, no longer needing the question to preserve dignity. Sleep came even deep and in dreams. She didn't run. When the child stirred first, Ayana called Jack not to seek permission or announce duty, but to share a truth. Jack placed hand on her belly, not possessively, just acknowledging, and spoke of tomorrow and doable things, more water, more blankets, softer morning light. They didn't build family by power, not by command rights, ownership rights, fear, but by choices repeated daily, keeping word through small actions. The brothers who'd come and gone kept respectful distance. The community didn't encroach but stood at the edge, enough to protect without invading. And in how the surrounding world adjusted to those boundaries, Ayana understood peace could spread when lived rightly. Some afternoons, she stood on the porch looking at opening valley, hand on belly, thinking of roads traveled, places where the question was sole armor, then back at the cabin where it needed no asking, not because wrong, but because it had fulfilled its role. Jack stood beside, not hugging tight, not pulling close, just enough so wind wasn't colder, and in that proper distance, intimacy had room to breathe. When night fell, stove fire steady, and silence no longer a void to fill, but a place for chosen things to rest. Family formed when people were called by right names, boundaries respected, peace built by choice not power. If this story touched you, please subscribe to not miss the next journeys about kindness, honor, and people living on the edge, but never losing their humanity. See you in the next story, where we'll sit by the fire again, listening to another piece of life told with sincerity.